Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, since I'm kind of doing a little bit of work at home, I figured I'd do a real quick video on a little bit of map study for fall fishing. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about fall bass migrations, and we're going to be focused on highland reservoirs, or just reservoirs in general. You know, we're talking about southern reservoirs, any man-made fishery that has shad in it as the primary forage species. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about. So this covers a wide range of different types of reservoirs, like I mentioned, highland reservoirs, even canyon reservoirs, river reservoirs like Lake Chickamauga and the rest of the TVA systems. Those are the type of lakes that we're going to be talking about. There's a lot more that fit into this category. As long as it's got shad and it's a man-made reservoir that has a lot of different arms and creeks, that's the type of fishery that we're going to be talking about in general. And we're going to be using the Navionics app on my iPad. This is a tool that I use all the time. We're going to dive right in here. And we're going to be talking about Lake Chickamauga. We're just going to be using that as an example right now, just because I live here, and you know, I can accurately kind of explain some of the migratory routes that these fish take during this time of year. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to zoom in here, and we're going to go to menu. We're going to go to map options after we get this out of the way. We're going to go to map options, and I want to turn on relief shading just to spruce things up. Doesn't that look nice? It's always nice to have some color shading in there, relief shading. All right, so let's start off. During the fall, the first thing we need to really establish is the fact that the fish's motivation, the bass's motivation this time of year, is of course feeding. They're feeding up for the winter time, and so they're going to be following the primary species of forage that we're going to be talking about, which is shad. And during the fall, the shad are going to be moving from various parts of the lake, primarily the main lake system or the main creek areas of a lake, and they're going to start making their way into the backs of these creeks. So let's take a creek. Let's take a creek such as this one right here, for example. Okay, and these are all just generals. This isn't exactly, you know, the locations that you may find more fish on any given year or any given day. This all changes, and I'm just using some of these as an example. So you're going to find that fish are going to be coming from the main lake, and they're going to start, you know, transitioning into the backs of these creeks. Now, one thing that's really important to note is that along the way from the main lake to the back of the creek, there's going to be a lot of different stopping points. This is a long process in general. This migration is going to take, you know, from October, you know, early October or mid-October, all the way through you know, the beginning of December. So this is going to take some time. And so what you want to be aware of is all the locations that these fish are going to use as they make their way from the main lake, main river channel, back into the creeks here. So for instance, looking at this creek right here, the first place that they're really going to be held up at is this long shoal we've got here. This long shoal, in my mind, this is where they're going to stop. I honestly have not fished this shoal that much during the fall, to be honest with you, but just looking at this map right here, this is the kind of area that I would look at and try first. Is early fall, I would start really focusing on something shallow like this, that's really close to the creek mouth. This is where they're going to stop, and the bass are going to be crashing on these fish and pushing them against this shallow shoal here. Okay, and you know, I would bet money that would be a productive area this time of year. As you start rolling into the back of this creek, I would say that, you know, you're going to be looking at some of the points, like this one right here, and then of course you got this point right here, this point as well, and you might have some fish that start getting pushed into this flat little pocket here. Both of these flat little pockets here, those are really shallow, that's the type of area that those fish are, again, going to be pushing those shad into. And then as things progress, what I've found is they don't just continue to really focus on these points near as much as they tend to once they get about halfway into the backs of these creeks, a lot of times they'll just all of a sudden, you know, push all the way to the back of the creek in general. One thing to note that is actually probably pretty important that I needed to state earlier is that this time of year, it's not just any creek that these shad are going to be focused on. You know, these very defined little creeks in the back that denote a active creek, an active inflow of fresh water, whether it is more fresh water, you know, that comes with the rain, or it's a creek that is continually running. That's not necessarily the most important factor. It just has to have a creek in the back of it that feeds into it. That is something that the shad are very focused on in the fall, and that's where the nutrients are going to be. That's where everything's happening. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, it doesn't have to be a continually running creek, but it just needs to be a creek that even during a fall rain is pretty active. And usually you're going to find those creeks have, you know, those very, very sharp, pointy backwaters, so the sharp, pointy outlines. So that's kind of one of the things that I look for. So the end of the fall, you're going to see the fish back here. Now, I kind of just for the sake of being efficient, I really like to start focusing on the shorter creeks. You can see here in the grand scheme of things, this is a fairly short creek. It's not very big, you know, and then of course you got these down here. This creek right here is called Wolf Tiber on Chickamauga here, but you got this big long one. This is great, you know, and I'm sure that there's a bunch of areas back here that are really good, but if you're just going to a lake and you're trying to break it down quickly, I really think that some of these shorter creeks that you see here are going to be more beneficial to you, just because this one's a little bit longer, but just because they're easier to break down in a short period of time. But all of these really, you know, are going to play a big role in the fall. You're going to find some, for whatever reason, it really, sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense. Whatever reason, the fish or the shad and the fish are really, really active in some over others. So it's just a matter of covering water until you find a creek that is really, really super active. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to catch fish. You know, I've been around plenty of these creeks and bays that are full of shad, full of bass, and they are so difficult to catch. They are just extremely difficult to catch because there's just too much bait fish in there. There's just too much competition. Let's look at another creek and see if I can kind of break things down a little bit. Let's actually go up to Watts Bar. We don't have the relief shading on Watts Bar, but this is one that I'm really not as familiar with. But again, these are principles that you can apply to pretty much any lake. So let's take this creek for instance. Actually, this one looks pretty good. So let's take this creek for instance. Again, the first areas that I really would start focusing on, you know, in October would be these shallow points and shoals here. Okay, topwaters are really good, chatterbaits are really good, spinnerbaits. I would be covering water on these shallow areas. So these would be the first places I'd turn. Maybe not necessarily these that are kind of the moderate depth, the you know, 10 to 20 foot zone, but the real shallow stuff tends to do really well. So like right there, the 3 foot zone, 6 foot, 5 foot, those areas. And then as the fall progresses, as the shad really start hauling all the way to the back, a lot of times you're going to see that as you're running into the backs of these creeks, you can see those big schools of shad just suspended in the middle of these creeks. So they don't necessarily get pushed to the shoreline all the time, but I definitely would check some of the points. Like this one right here looks pretty good, nice and shallow. I might even check some of the channel swings. You can see where the contour lines are really close together. That means that that's kind of a bluff wall, a steep bank, and a lot of times I can catch them really good there. But then, of course, by the end of the fall, you know, right around mid-November, late November, that's when I'm going to be solely focused right back here, backs of the creeks. And I will pay attention to the contours back here. Again, you know, as the fall progresses, I think that the heat of the fall is mid-November, and I think that most of those fish are going to be on the shallow flats in the very back of these creeks. But as it progresses again towards wintertime, that's when I'm going to start focusing on those areas that are slightly deeper, deeper and steeper, very close to those areas that they were in the backs of those shallow pockets. So start looking for those channel bends that where the creek channel kind of bends in towards the shoreline, and things of that sort. Areas that are deeper and steeper. That's where they're going to start transitioning away from the fall patterns and into the winter patterns. And so you can kind of stay on top of them as long as you kind of follow them that way. Just like the spring, I think the fall is one of the most productive time periods for bass fishing because you know, in the spring they're motivated by spawning. In the fall they are motivated by that migration of shad. So really, what should be on your mind is those creeks with fresh running water coming into the backs of them, and just paying attention to your maps, whether you're looking on your Navionics app on your iPhone, your iPad, or you've got your Navionics card in your unit. Pay attention to all those little details on the way back to those creeks. Once they get in the very backs of the creeks, it's very simple. They're just essentially fish, you know, busting shad, pushing shad onto those shallow flats, and it can be very easy then. But in between that time period, pay attention to those subtle little details, those shallow pieces of structure that those fish may be pushing those bait fish on, and so on and so forth. So I know that's a very broad approach to kind of breaking down a lake or a small portion of a lake, but it works every single year. You just got to get out there and really apply that kind of approach to your specific lake that you're fishing. But anyways, hopefully that helps. If you have any questions specifically, drop a comment below. But other than that, I appreciate you guys watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. I'll see you out on the water.